Hello, and thank you for joining us for this, which is unbelievably the last event in this calendar year of the Georgetown and Blackfriars and Campion Hall partnership. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to this, which is the 14th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and by Campion Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished panel and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to the chair for the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the button at the bottom of your screen. These will come to me during the session, and I will try to put them into some kind of order for the panel to consider. We urge you, please, to start to ask your questions right from the start, and I will try and put as many as possible to the panel. If you leave it too late, they might not get asked because we get bottlenecks at the end. So please do try from the beginning. So with that, I will soon disappear, and over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike, very much. It's a great pleasure to have our 14th program. We've gotten through the pandemic with this, and we're appreciative of all our guests. To wit, Astrid Caldas, who is originally from Brazil, is a senior climate scientist with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, based here in Washington. Kea Chatterjee is executive director of the U.S. Climate Action Network, and we'll ask her to explain this a bit later. She's the author of the intriguingly named book, The Zero Footprint Baby, How to Save the Planet While Raising a Healthy Baby. Chris Church is co-director of Community Environment Associates in the United Kingdom and works at the grassroots on climate change issues. Todd Stern is now a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, but from 2009 to 2016, he was the senior point person in the Obama administration for climate change, working in the State Department and the White House, and had a key role in creating the Paris Agreement that President Obama's successor, Donald Trump, withdrew the United States from shortly after becoming president. So let's, and I should add, President Biden has put the United States back into the Paris Agreement. We'll see how long that lasts. I want to start with this overwhelming question of whether climate scientists, climate advocates, climate activists have managed to put this in the center of people's attention worldwide. Astrid, I want to ask you, do you think, is there an issue of that remains of false equivalencies here? You can believe in the climate change crisis or not, and you can argue over whether there's something that needs to be done. Have we moved the issue beyond that?
Certainly, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. This issue is very complicated because it has become very politicized, right? So in many countries, the politics come before the reasoning and before the science, which is unfortunate. So the main thing is that some people will not want to trust the science because they don't seek the science. They seek the information that will confirm what they want to hear or read. So these are the perception biases that everybody has. And those are across the board. So the people like me who studied the climate science, I tend to look at the data and I tend to look at the things that will confirm what I see. Only the people who look for things that are not the true data and not the true science also find that confirmation, because there is a lot of stuff out there that's not really data-based than evidence-based. So we created this, as you said, there's this dichotomy. There's this people who do not believe and people who believe, and people in the end, because the media does not help, and a lot of the social media also doesn't help, a lot of people end up seeing a lot of the information and getting in doubt about what the truth is. So I would say that that's the main issue.
Todd, first Todd and then Chris, I wonder if you could address the issue of whether climate change has gotten beyond ordinary politics in the United States and in the United Kingdom in particular. Maybe Chris, you could also tell us a bit about the picture in Europe. Todd, have we turned the tide back since Donald Trump took the United States out of the Paris Agreement for several years?
Well, so I think we've turned the tide in a lot of ways. I think with respect to the specific question that you're asking about, essentially belief in the issue and as distinguished between those who are deniers or skeptics, I think that there's been a lot of progress there. And interestingly, if you look at polling data, and a good place that I sometimes consult is the Yale Communications Climate Change Communications Project. You will see a steady uptick of people's belief in the reality of this issue, which actually did not change much during the Trump years. So we're in the sort of low 70% range of people who believe in climate change, somewhat a little bit less, a smaller number who believe that it's human caused. But that's progress in the United States. I think, I agree with what Astrid said. I would sort of make one distinction, which I think that you will find in many countries, the politics dominates in the sense that countries might not do as much as they should do. But there are not that many countries where you find the kind of denialism, the fight over whether it's real or whether it's happening or whether it's a lot of bunk, as Trump and others would say. My experience is you see that in the United States, you see it somewhat in Australia. You see it in a few places, but not that many. So definitely politicized in the sense of whether countries are doing enough, but many of those countries who are not doing enough would still accept the notion that there's climate change in the way that the deniers don't. But again, even in those places like the US where there has been that denialism, I think that is gradually going down.
Chris, be sure to unmute yourself. How about in the United Kingdom? Is there progress there as well? Many people compare your Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to Donald Trump in his manner and his presentation. Has he been a problem on this issue?
No, Boris Johnson has made all the right noises about climate change. I think it's fair to say that we have quite a strong, broad political consensus that something needs to be done about climate change. We have very high public awareness. 85% of people have said they're concerned about it. It's the top public concern last month in the polls. And I think that same consensus exists across much of Europe, Germany, Scandinavia. So the question for us is we look at America and think, why is the center right, if you like, or the right so politicized about climate change and back themselves into a corner of denial? We've got a lot of questions here, but they're much more about what do we do and how fast do we do it, rather than whether we should do it. We have the consensus and we need to build on that and turn the kind of slightly glib statements of people like Boris Johnson that this is, the most important issue of our time into effective action. But we have got a net zero target. We've got a lot to work on.
Sandy, I might add one just small point,
Yes.
which is a very interesting poll that I saw. This goes back at least a couple of years ago now, 2-3 years, where the biggest reason that people who were opposed to it were opposed was because Democrats were for it. Not that they, so I mean, the reason why climate change didn't exist or wasn't real was because Democrats thought it was. So you have that kind of politicization in the United States as well.
That's
I
pretty
think
severe.
if I could just add one little thing. I think the critical point for us perhaps came about 2 or 3 years ago when the BBC, our mainstream media, gave up on the idea that if they were going to talk about climate change, they had to have someone who said it was real and someone who said it wasn't. I mean, they don't have someone coming along when they do global stuff and say, we've got now someone who says the earth is flat. You know, we've gone beyond that kind of false dichotomy. So I think that's really helped, that people now accept this is happening. They may argue about how fast or how far it is about human cause, but, you know, people can see it happening.
Kaya, you're very much in the midst of the political debate over this in the US. Do you have a sense of how the recent COP26 conference in Glasgow might have affected opinion in the United States? I don't know whether you were at the conference in Glasgow or not. I should have asked.
Yeah, I was not at the COP, but we had a lot of people there and I was following very closely. And to be honest, there were plenty of times when I had more access sitting at home than my colleagues did who had made the long trip there, just because access was so difficult for civil society at that meeting. I don't actually believe that COPs change public opinion very much in the United States. I think it's one thing that's important to, you know, a framework that's important for me in terms of understanding the United States. It's not like the UK, and that like everyone's not watching the BBC, people are watching different media. And, you know, there's something called the Reagan alignment, which was an alignment that lasted for decades and is still with us today between, you know, warmongering imperialists, between fossil fuel executives and pharmaceutical executives, between the far Christian right, and people who don't want, you know, women or people of color to have power. And they have very much defined a common sense in this country that even when someone tries to go up against, you're still fighting that common sense. And I feel like that is really like a paradigm that we have to shift. And it's fundamentally anchored by white supremacy. And I think that understanding the United States as a place where we are in a struggle against white supremacy and fascism is really the context of all of this. And if you ignore that and try to have a conversation about, well, what can change opinion on climate change, you're not actually going to change opinion on climate change, because the context of the country is a context of white supremacy that has to be dismantled for us to break through and prevail. Now, this country has had a different alignment that's held power and common sense in the past and gotten through a common sense where we take care of each other. And I believe we're moving back towards that again. And that's what you see in what did shift public opinion in the United States around the COP, which was the struggle to pass Build Back Better, which we are still in the middle of. There was an attempt to pass this bill before COP, which would have made it possible or believable for the United States to meet our nationally determined contribution, our NDC. Now, with it not having passed yet, it's not really credible. The United States came into COP not being really credible. And while it didn't change public opinion, it kind of solidified people's views who are paying attention that we actually have to break down the common sense of this country, dismantle white supremacy, and get to a common sense where people understand we've got to take care of each other here in this country. And then we also have to extend that common sense to the rest of the world, and that we all have to take care of each other on this planet.
What you say, Kaya, I mean, people are very worried about breaking apart the consensus at the moment. And a lot of very bleak projections are being made about the midterm congressional elections in 2022 and the presidential election in 2024. Astrid, I wonder if we could come back to you. And, you know, there is a tendency, and I think it takes hold in this country too, to blame mostly the United States, or in large measure the United States, for not moving people, as if the United States still had the influence that it once believed itself to have. Are there other countries? And I mean, I think the other big three polluters are thought to be India, China, and Russia. Is there more progress in those countries as well? Be sure that you unmute.
Yes. I was just listening in. Yes, I was going to add Brazil, which is a lot of emissions from deforestation that they keep saying is going down, and it's actually not, and it's only getting worse. During the COP, they came out with very imaginative and creative math to say that they're, reducing deforestation and emissions is going to happen, but it was just a matter of how they were doing the math. In fact, they were giving themselves space to emit more. Brazilians are very creative in terms of, these things. I would say that the United States is not the only one, right? We know that, but there are different aspects to it. In the United States, because of our style of government and because of the force of capitalism, the special interests from private companies, this works much more against the general consensus of the people on climate change than in China or in India or in Brazil. It's very different because people have a lot more opinion here. In other countries, it may be the government that is doing most of the things. So people like to blame the United States because a lot of people hate the United States all over the world. And that's a fact. A lot of people are just, oh, those damn Yankees, You hear that from everywhere. I have friends in Brazil who have no reason to hate the United States, but they do. There's this thing about the United States has everything. And so they are also blamed for most of it. But there are nuances there. And I think, I'm looking at Kea, and because I know that she knows a lot about these discussions internally too in other countries, and I wonder if she has anything to say about that.
What about
Tammy,
it, Kea?
could I
I'm
put a
sorry.
word in?
Yes, please, Todd. Yes.
So I have a little bit of a different view. I think that I think it's enormously important that the other big piece of the Biden legislative effort gets done. So the infrastructure bill got done. Now what he calls the Build Back Better legislation also get done. It will get done, if it does, in a pared down version as compared to what was originally proposed. But but nonetheless, it would still be a huge big thing for the United States to do. I don't think that countries know the United States legislative process is difficult. And so I don't actually think that countries have concluded the United States is not going to do this right now. My own guess, just as a political observer, is if this will probably get done. I mean, it's ugly and messy, but I think it'll get done. If it doesn't, it's a really big problem. But I think that it probably will. I also think that there are all sorts of issues completely legitimate that Kay has raised. But I also don't think it's the case that we cannot take the action that we need to take on climate, or at least start moving that forward at high velocity, unless and until we solve all the broader issues. It's not that I disagree that there are those broader issues there, but I think we can make progress. I think we have to make progress on climate change. If the notion is we can't do it until we've sort of fixed the broader problems that Kea mentioned, I think would be a problem with respect to climate change. I think it takes time. I do think that the issues that even apart from the broader kind of Reagan alignment analysis that Kea was talking about, if we end up going down a road which is dangerously threatened right now of really profoundly undermining our democracy between now and the next presidential election, that would be a huge problem with respect to our capacity to do what we need to do on climate change, or to be able to exercise leadership in the world, which we still are able to do. I think countries do look to us still very much, particularly as I inhabited a diplomatic role for almost 7 years, and I think that the U.S. being in or not being in makes a huge difference to countries around the world. They want us in. And hopefully we will be able to be in and stay in and be effective.
Chris, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Kaya, Astrid sort of invited you to talk a little about the international perspective on this. Do you have some thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe if I can just first address, like, you know, the
Of course.
like point of disagreement of where Todd is. I just don't think that we are a functional democracy right now in the United States. And I question our ability to govern if we don't have like basic voting rights. If we don't feel it, when you look at the Supreme Court, and most of the justices were appointed by people who did not have a majority vote. When you just look at the basic functions of this country, it's very hard to believe that the will of the people can be heard. And when you study this stuff, it is true across countries. Like, we know how to, as movements, we know how to get things done in a fast way, in a deep way. Like, I have spent more than a decade studying this. It's the same whether it's the Indian independence movement, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, or the United States civil rights movement. We can do it even under these conditions. So I'm not saying that we have to wait. I'm saying we have to use the information we know. We know what works. You know, it's very well studied, and that is what we are implementing right now. And you know, I will try not to get into those details right now because you asked me specifically to address the international. And I think part of that question to Astrid was also like, is this the fault of the United States? Of course, this is the fault of the United States. I'm not saying that it isn't everyone at play here, but I think it's Senator Markey who says all the time, you know, if the CO2 molecules were colored according to the flag of origin, you'd see a lot of red, white, and blue in the atmosphere. Like, of course, we have a lot of blame here, and there's a lot of onus on us to deal with this issue, which is why we're pushing so hard to get this bill done so that we can believe we can do it. But I also think that this rise of fascism, this rise of nationalism is not unique to the United States. We see it in Brazil. We see it in India. And I think that, like, to ignore that context and think you can just talk about greenhouse gas emissions is naive. I think we actually need to push against fascism as part and push and dismantle white supremacy as part of our struggle as the climate crisis. And in introducing the Green New Deal in the United States, we work to bring these issues together so that we would have a strong enough movement so that we can win. And for me, what I see in Build Back Better is that progressive strategy is actually the only thing that is working to start to advance actual action in the United States.
Chris, what do you tell people at the grassroots, and what do you hear from people about the grassroots in the UK about how to make progress on this issue?
Well, I think there are two parallel struggles. One is the one that Kaya and Astrid has set out, which is the struggle for global justice and transformation. But I think at a local level, in terms of engaging people, there is also the struggle that we need to slash emissions by 10% a year, 8% a year, whatever it is, very fast as we possibly can. And I'm not entirely convinced we can wait for the collapse of capitalism for that. We have to start doing these measures now. They create jobs, livelihoods, they clean up our air, they make our cities better places to live. So from our viewpoint, I think there is still a huge movement of people, getting people to move from awareness to alignment, to engagement, to action. And part of that action is about cutting emissions. It may well, hopefully, lead people on to understanding the causes of this. I mean, you mentioned, where does all the pollution come from? Historically speaking, the UK has put out more carbon than any other nation, because we started a long time before others. We were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So we have a responsibility on that, but we also need to really push for rapid change, because every year we don't cut emissions takes us closer, much closer to heading for 2 degrees rather than 1.5. Every month we delay makes it harder to get to net zero.
What will be the consequences? I don't know who wants to take this first. In our title of this program, we asked, will we be able to change the climate before the climate changes us? If we don't succeed in some of these concrete steps that Chris just outlined, what are the practical consequences we can foresee in even 5 or 10 years, let alone 20 or 30 years into the future? Astrid, do you want to take that?
That's okay, I'm ready to go for it. I think, well, there are many points to this, right? I mean, we know that we need to act fast, and we know that the sooner we act, the worst of the impacts will be avoided. There are impacts that are out there that cannot be avoided anymore, and we need to work towards adapting to those and how to best face those so that there's not too much impact on people and livelihoods, particularly livelihoods. So the world will be a different place. The world will still be here, but it will be a different place if we don't act fast. In 10 years, we have the opportunity to make big change. There are studies that show that if actually emissions were completely eliminated, actually climate change and global warming would reverse within 10 to 15 years. The studies just last year, just recently. So, but none of the models that exist actually do that because it's impossible to stop emissions, right? If it doesn't exist. So all the models go into reducing emissions and net zero and this and that. But we know that there will be an impact, and we know that we can change things. And particularly for the people and the nations that are in danger of disappearing right now and are looking at places to go, I think this would be a truly important step to do. So the time frame that we work is extremely important for the results that we want and the risks that we are willing to take.
Well, we've heard some very dramatic predictions of coastal areas in the United States and many other countries being severely threatened if the warming of the Earth continues at the pace it's been going. What else? What else might not that scare tactics are necessarily the best. Chris, you had your hand up for a moment, then Kaya.
Yeah, I mean, in 1989, I heard my first scientist talk about climate change. Someone from America, sadly, I've forgotten his name, but he said something that stayed with me. He said, we are not, this was 1989, entirely sure if this is happening, but we are very sure. And he said, if you do, the first signs you're going to see are more floods and more fires and more droughts and more cold. In other words, he said, the system will go out of balance, up, down, side to side, if you like. And he's been bang on the money. What we have seen, your wildflowers, your floods, droughts, this is a system that's moving out of balance. It's very hard to predict, I think, where the worst impacts will hit first. But that's what's happening. You have to really put your blinkers on to ignore what is going on, whether it's in Siberia or Vancouver or Australia.
Todd and Kaya, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I
Sure.
mean,
Go ahead, Todd.
Go ahead, Kay. Go ahead.
I just to put it in simple terms, it's food, water, shelter. Yes, whole communities have burned to the ground. There's nothing left but ashes in plenty of communities. The heat waves will get worse. We know human beings can't survive at certain wet bulb temperatures, and when you have massive heat waves, people die. We know that that really there is already an enormous amount of conflict over water and food. That is already resulting in mass migrations. And so I think that, as Astrid said, it's not like the planet's going to go away. I don't even think humans are at stake if we don't get our acts together. What is at stake is our humanity. And if we get to the point where people are under constant stress because they don't have access to food, water, and shelter, we will not maintain our humanity. We will not maintain our ability to invest in music and arts and the things that make us human.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think that the only additional thing I would say is that first of all, it's happening. Every scientific estimate, which has been received with skepticism, has in fact underestimated what's happening repeatedly. Science is behind the curve of what's happening. I think that we are seeing almost biblical weather at this point all over the world, and constantly here in the United States, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and I think that this is going to be a full-blown national security issue. It essentially is getting there now. Food and water, as Kaya said. So I think that, and all of this is happening with temperature having gone up about 1.1 degree. So anybody who thinks that those who call for limiting global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade are Chicken Little running around, exaggerating the concerns. Not really. I mean, it will be unbelievably difficult to hold emissions down low enough to meet a 1.5 target. There's no doubt about that. Like unprecedentedly difficult. But it is completely wrong to think that well, we don't really have to worry about that goal. If we get, if we can hold to 2, that'd be good enough. It won't be good enough. Again, everything that we're seeing now is just gargantuan fires, heat that's going up to the point that gets close to the human capacity to do work and survive. That's happening at 1.1. So we got a lot of work to do.
There's some very strange climate events at the moment in this country and elsewhere in the world. These tornadoes that just swept through in the wintertime in the South and in the heart of the country is, I don't know who's best qualified. I keep thinking of you as the scientist in the group, Astrid. I don't know who's best qualified to say, could, rather than talking about just prayer being the solution to the tornadoes, and I don't mean to denigrate the role of prayer, should we be saying these tornadoes could be averted in the future if we only do what?
Well, I always say I'm not against prayers either, but they are usually a cure for the soul, right? They help us face things. And a lot of times people do indeed believe that they are helping with the facts. And they may, and I'm not discounting that. But
it's beyond our bailiwick today to try to solve that problem.
But among the many extreme events that exist, like fire, extreme heat, hurricanes, extreme precipitation, tornadoes are among the ones that we don't have a lot of evidence of the impact of climate change on the tornadoes themselves. We have seen in the United States, there was a study a couple of years ago that showed that the tornado alley has shifted east in the last 30, 40 years, maybe 50 years, I don't remember from when, but it has shifted east. And this path of tornadoes was east of the traditional tornado alley. So this is something that study did a couple of years ago and that we're seeing happening now. It's not the first time that we had tornadoes in December. That has happened before. Like many things that are happening now have happened before, once or twice, but not in succession as they are happening now, like 7 years in a row, that hurricanes start before the season, 3 years, that hurricanes exhaust the names, extreme precipitation over and over again, flood over and over again. Things are happening to an extent and frequency that's much bigger. They happened in the past, and a lot of climate deniers use that to say, oh, there was a big flood in Texas, in Houston in 19 whatever. Yes, there was a big fire somewhere also. There was the big hurricane or whatever, the big flood of the Mississippi. But those were kind of individual events. What we are seeing is this, the frequency and the extent of these extreme events. And many of them do have what we call the fingerprint of global warming on them, and studies of attribution have actually connected them. They don't say this was because of climate change, but this was made more likely and was made stronger by climate change. So this is what we are seeing now. But the tornadoes themselves were terrifying. They were horrible people. They're still finding people that have perished in those tornadoes. But the fact is that I think the number of tornadoes have also increased. The number of tornado deaths have increased, related to tornado outbreaks have also, been on the rise, and we see that those tornado outbreaks are happening more often.
Kim, may I give you a moment to explain the title of your book, How to Save the Planet While Raising a Healthy Baby? Zero Footprint Baby.
Sure. So I don't have a baby anymore. He's 11. He's a climate activist in his own right now. I think that one thing to keep in mind is that there are people out there who are very, very much, probably a lot of people listening today, who very much understand all of this, right? Who understand we're in a crisis and are trying to make the right choices. And so I wrote that book for that category of people who are already alarmed, and who want to think about, like, what are the things in my day-to-day life where I don't have to wait for policy. I can immediately start reducing my personal, contribution to pollution as an individual, and how can I get into collective action as a parent and as a member of society. And so I think that those folks, we have something called the spectrum of support that we refer to a lot as climate activists. And as activists more broadly, where you've got the people who really care on one side and the people who are really actively trying to stop you, fossil fuel executives on the other side. And what we're always trying to do is move people this way, right? And so, we need to have resources for people who are here, which is why I wrote that book. And we need that group to grow. So we need people who are kind of like activists to become part of the movement. We need people who are passive to become activists. And we need the people who are neutral in society and passive opponents to move over to being at least passive supporters of activists. And this is done through a whole range of things. So like that book is very much written for the activist community. I think it's also really important to understand and have a deep study of what moves people who are in the middle, those neutrals and those people who are passive opponents. It is not books like the one I wrote. It was not the purpose of it. The thing that moves those people is movements. And so, I referenced this before, but I think it's important for us to understand that, like, when oppressors make themselves overreach, that is when you move the people in the middle. And you have to be really careful about the way you do that. But like examples are like, in the United States, the Freedom Riders, Black and white people getting on buses, getting attacked, that moved people from being neutral into being passive supporters because their values weren't aligned. On the issue of climate change, when people in the United States saw the water protectors at Standing Rock get attacked by dogs on their territory, on treaty protected territory, that moved people from being neutral into passive supporters. And I think one thing we need to understand as we try to move society, which we know how to do, is that in the win conditions of any movement. So if you take gay marriage in the United States, in the win conditions, your opposition actually grows, and that's okay. So when you actually get to a state where, okay, we now, not to say we've won this struggle, but gay marriage is legal in the United States, no one is neutral anymore. That middle is gone, because you ask people, like, do you believe love is love, or do you want to discriminate? No one can say, I've never thought about gay marriage, because we forced a which side are you on moment, and people had to move. People moved to be passive supporters. But what you see is that the opposition actually gets activated. They grow a little bit. So you get their passive supporters to move over. You get the neutrals to move over over in the win condition. But you've actually grown your opposition. And this is why I think it's important for us to understand, because lots of people misleadingly think, oh, we need to negotiate with the fossil fuel industry executives. That is not how you win. You win by winning over the people in the middle. And you need to have a whole set of tactics to move everyone to your side. And again, like, the book is very much only geared towards people who are already there, but all the things we do in society have got to be to move everyone in this direction, except your opponents who are literally being paid to believe something else. Someone like Senator Joe Manchin, who is blocking Build Back Better, he literally makes more income from a coal company than he does as a senator. Like, his income comes from this place, and that's who we have to go through to pass this thing, if people want to understand why we're not moving at scale in the United States. That's a very large answer to a narrow question about my book, but I just want to say
That's
that
fine.
it's just
That's
for
fine.
people already listening here.
Right.
If you're
Speaking of
pregnant,
books-
buy it.
Speaking of books, Todd, you're working on a memoir or a book about the lessons you've learned from your involvement with climate change issues, if I'm not mistaken. And how would you characterize what you have learned and think might be the most effective path
Well,
forward?
Yeah, Sandy. So my book is about the 7-year road to
Right.
the Paris Agreement, which coincides with Obama getting elected, me coming in to be the climate envoy, and that 7 years of negotiation with countries all over the world, and how it happened, really starting in Copenhagen, which was a mess in many respects, but important in other respects, and then kind of how that all played out diplomatically, and then with some thoughts about where I think it needs to go with respect to the Paris regime. So, that's what it's about. I don't know if
Can you distill that into advice for the immediate future?
Well, I think that it is important, really important, that there's a lot of things that need to be done in order to contain climate change, that have to do with technology, that have to do with domestic policy, that have to do with all sorts of things like that. There's also a really important piece that has to do with the international regime, because this is a problem. I remember reading in some article at some point that referred to climate change as a super wicked problem, to use the language of Boston. But it is. It's a tremendously difficult problem that if the United States did absolutely everything, if we were the model citizen and did everything we possibly could, and other countries weren't acting, we wouldn't be anywhere. So this is a problem that is quintessentially global. The pollution in India is the same as the pollution in Indiana. And so you have to have an international regime that works. I think that the Paris regime is not perfect by any means, but it's the first time, actually going all the way back since 1992, that you were able to get all 195 countries lined up in the right direction. Now, they're lined up in the right direction, but the nature of the Paris system is that countries make their own decisions periodically about what their emission reductions are going to be. So it's nationally determined, because you couldn't do it any other way. You've got to get in climate negotiations. All 195 countries have to agree. That's the way the system works. It's a consensus system, and so you couldn't have gotten a deal done without that sort of national determination. You have some countries moving, not enough. The biggest country that hasn't moved in a way that's necessary to be aligned with 1.5 is China, which right now is 27% of global emissions. A bunch of other countries have moved, some haven't. But you've got to bring all of them together. I think the thing that was, in some ways, maybe the most important thing in the end in Paris, certainly one of the most important, was that a new kind of coalition developed, which came to be known as the High Ambition Coalition, which was inspired by a leader from the Marshall Islands, Tony DeBruym, who's since passed away, but who talked about rich and poor, big and small, countries all have to work together on this. And that happened in Paris. And you had the EU and the US, many developed countries, but also the vulnerable and poor countries all over the world. The ones who were not part of that were China and a number of its friends. So in order to get on track globally toward that 1.5 goal, you're going to have to see that kind of coalition again, and you're going to have to see that coalition that drives those countries and puts pressure on countries like China that are just not doing enough yet. And of course, to go all the way back to where we started, if the US doesn't get its big legislation done, then the US capacity to lead here or to be on the right side falls apart. So this is really, really important legislation for the world as well as for the US.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Before we go back to Mike to deal with 22 questions that have now come in as I see it, Chris, I'd like to go to you for a brief coda here. You strike me as an optimist, and so I'm wondering what you think the next immediate encouraging signs might be, just quickly.
Oh, I think trying to look for encouragement at the moment is an active action for optimism. But I am a stubborn optimist. I think we did see, we didn't see a lot come out of COP26, but we did see a few faltering steps forward. I think some of the interesting stuff, the agreements around methane as an untalked about greenhouse gas, the activity between China and America, it's all talk, but if you don't talk about it, nothing happens. The challenge for us is to turn the statements that were made at the peak of an optimistic, at the early optimism of that conference, into funded programs. I think we are seeing Todd mentioned the fact that pretty much every prediction has been exceeded. One of the slightly encouraging things is that every prediction about the growth of clean energy made by pretty much anyone has been vastly exceeded. The technology is not the answer, but without the technology, we cannot get to the answers. And I think one of the encouraging things, I have to say, in Britain, we look at America and think, why aren't you going down the renewables route as fast as you can? The Chinese are taking this. We've got the world's largest offshore wind. You're still talking about putting a few turbines up on one little bit of coast. We can make green energy work. And I think that's not really the problem anymore. It's buildings, it's transport, it's food. But electrification, cleaning up the electricity system is a place where I think you can say there is some grounds for optimism.
Thanks, Chris.
But others may
Mike,
disagree.
I'm going to get to Mike for the questions, and some remaining points maybe ought to be slipped in the answers to those questions. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, well, we have had a huge number of questions in today. I'm going to start with one from name Benisaya. I hope I've got your pronunciation right. I apologize if I haven't. How do we change, Naim says, how do we change the narrative from just paralyzing doom and gloom to one that focuses on the positive changes that might come about through action now? How about steps that can be made, small and large, that can empower people instead of creating hopelessness? So we want suggesting that we change the dialogue a little bit. Kaya, you shouldn't have smiled because I'm going to come to you first, all right?
Yeah, I was just reminded of a lovely video that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made of the future where we pass the Green New Deal and how beautiful it is. And that we really are in a place where we take care of each other and people have jobs doing beautiful things they want to do outside, like restoring wetlands. And yes, we still have storms, but we actually have mutual aid and infrastructure to take care of each other. We have local agriculture in our communities. We have, we have a diverse and flourishing sense of community. And I think that is within our grasp right now. And so just to like reiterate some of what Chris was saying there at the end, like we are investing, I mean, like we are switching to renewable energy. Of course, we need to electrify everything. Of course, we need to make very, very big changes very fast, but it is very much within our grasp, a much better future than even the present that we have today. It's not just that we're stopping bad things, we actually are moving towards a beautiful place where people take care of each other. And I think that, again, like I think what we've seen in the United States is somewhat of a move towards that new way of thinking, away from neoliberal ways of thinking about solutions like carbon taxes, which everyone tends to think like, oh, now I have to pay something, to solutions where it's like, oh no, we're going to invest in transit equity. So people who don't have access to cars don't have to wait for the bus. We're going to invest in housing equity so that people don't live on the streets. We actually have housing for all. We're going to invest in these things that are beautiful for us as a society. And I believe it's going to happen. And I believe we're the ones who are going to make it happen. And the people listening today are going to be part of that.
Thanks for that. I think that was great answer. Can we just take that a little bit? Astrid, have you got any answer to that? But I'll give you another question that came from Angela Preston, who thinks that she might maybe have an answer. How many women are decision makers in the big climate changing issues? Do we need to be bigger in our thoughts about this? It's the same kind of question, I think. Astrid?
I don't know the number, but there are lots of women involved on climate science itself, on climate communication, on climate policy, on climate advocacy. So women are out there. The thing is, to fight the establishment, to fight the white supremacy culture and male supremacy culture. There are lots of things that we see all the time where a lot of people do not realize how many women are out there, because as per the status quo, a lot of the people that we see are actually white males. So we are out there, we are fighting. There are lots of us there. If you saw the COP this year and you saw the sessions, oh my God, so many powerful women. The woman from Barbados was like absolutely unbelievable. Her speech, everybody's talking about that. Look at Sandy just saying, oh yeah, that was great. So yeah, no, there are lots of women, out there. And I dare say that women have a vision for the future that many men may not have, independently of race, ethnicity, or anything, because women have the nurture, women have the connection with the earth that many times comes from being mothers, from being caretakers. So I always see that connection of the female with the earth. And I think that's a very important aspect that many people don't talk about. I talk about science a lot, for instance, but there are many important things that the women are doing out there.
Thank you for that. Just a follow-up question on that. Some of the remedies to the situation result in economic difficulties for many nations, rich and poor. Has enough been done to alleviate an economic crisis in different parts of the world, particularly in the poorer parts of the world? Todd, would you like to take that?
Well, I think self-evidently not enough has happened. I think that is certainly right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a lot more to say about that. Maybe a couple things. I think that that on a domestic basis, the notion of climate justice and environmental justice has become much more important. It's a part of the Biden plan overall, and part of his original pledge was that I think 40% of the federal investments that involve climate change domestically should be in disadvantaged communities that have been unfairly disadvantaged. And that's at a domestic level. Internationally, there is an enormous need for financial and other kinds of assistance to help countries who are vulnerable. And I mean, all countries are experiencing climate change, but the countries who are the poorest have the least capacity to deal with it. And so that's a problem that has not been adequately addressed at all in what's happened on the international climate front so far. I mean, it's been addressed to some extent, but the amount of capital that will need to be mobilized in years to come is much greater than what has happened so far. But I'll turn it over to Esther or Kay if they have something to
Yeah,
add.
I think that at this conference of parties, we had an enormous failure to recognize the need for money specifically for loss and damage. And this has been a continual failure on the part of the United States government to recognize that we are beyond the ability to adapt to certain changes. We are beyond the ability to mitigate our way out of everything. And we have to accept that people need economic support. And I know people kind of like roll their eyes when we raise it, but the reality is you can't really understand the climate crisis without understanding that this came from colonialism and people of European descent spread it like stamping out indigenous cultures that were sustainable and bringing a culture that is unsustainable as well while they're stealing wealth. You cannot ignore that history and think you can just come to today and solve the climate crisis without addressing that. And I think that I feel like we're on track in the United States, like to beat back this enormous threat of fascism and white nationalism, inshallah, like knock on wood here. But I feel like we have not really expanded this notion of we've got to take care of each other to the rest of the world. And we need to move our mindset from one where we're in competition and we're looking at what other countries are doing, like, oh, like that's either some competition or we're mad, to one where like, no, we are actually all in this together. We're all just people trying to survive. And there is a real history of harm here that needs to be acknowledged at the same time that we acknowledge there are real impacts that are beyond adaptation and mitigation. And we need to do that. And we need to do it with a human rights lens. So, the United States government was just bad at this COP on human rights, on loss and damage. And we need to be pushing for better.
Thank you for that. Hayley Randall comes in with the question. I've heard a lot of anti-capitalist rhetoric today. Is more government bills like Build Back Better the main avenue towards solutions? Astrid, do you have a go at that?
No, economics are not my forte, but from what I know about the Build Back Better, I think that it's a huge step for leading us where we need to go. All the things that are in that bill that are related to climate and environmental justice, for that matter, which we are circling here, talking about it, but it should be one of the main focus. And the Build Back Better has a lot of climate-related environmental justice. Protecting those who are hit the worst and everything. So I think it is a very good means of getting where we need to be. It's a good start. The economic impacts of that, I don't know very much. Maybe Todd knows more, or Kaya, or thanks.
Shall I go to Chris and say, Chris, do you see within the UK or in Europe policies coming through which are more positive in their type of approach rather than the negative, this is what's going to happen to us and so on and so forth?
Well, I think we are starting to look at how we do this. How do we electrify our transport system? How do we actually tackle the huge amount of energy waste in our homes? And we've had our own versions of green recovery, of Build Back Better. I think other nations, Germany's new plans look a lot better than ours. Our problem is, as I said, we have got a cross-party consensus on climate change. But I think we're seeing the centre-right and the right kind of doing little more really than paying lip service. We have some good conservative politicians who get this, but we have a treasury that's opposing the level of investment that we desperately need to make. But I think if you look for the good policies, they are there. As I say, go and look at Germany, some of the Scandinavian nations. People have made the commitments. They've talked about them, and maybe people said, this is just a bunch of talk. But 2 years later, there's a budget, there's a team of people working to make it happen. And as Kaya said, there are huge opportunities here to create much better cities, much better places to live, much better societies. We can tackle air pollution and clean up our energy system and tackle the climate and give people better ways to travel. What's not to like?
Mike, in terms of the, if I could just add a word,
Yes,
I think
please, Tom.
in terms of the narrative or the argument that's being made, I think there has been a lot of change. And I think that Kaya mentioned the Green New Deal, which I think was, maybe the first big legislative initiative that framed the issue in a way that was very positive in terms of creating jobs and growth and growth in all parts of the U.S. And I think that in many respects Biden has picked that up and framed what he's trying to do on climate change very much as part of of economic growth and job growth and environmental justice. So I think all of that is important. I also think, though, that the notion that there's really bad things that we have to avoid, and we can do that in these ways is. You've got to have that part of it too. And people see it all around them. I mean, people are motivated because they see the dangers around them, but you've got to frame those things in a way that's economically strong. And I actually think that is happening.
Thank you. A kind of follow-up question, I suppose, from Brian Alexander. We're talking on a higher education forum, really, with America and the UK. But Brian says, what do panel members see as the role of higher education in addressing the climate crisis? Sorry. Who'd like to take that? Sandy, would you like to take that?
Well, sure. I think it's a very interesting question. A lot of universities have faced this issue of fossil fuels, using fossil fuels, investing in fossil fuels. And what's interesting is many people in universities are in the forefront of activism on these things. And then somehow when the issue gets turned on the universities, it seems as if we're very radical. And it's really not. To talk about how we get our energy is not a radical matter. It's a very basic matter. I'm intrigued by the question that came in also, Mike, about the attacks on capitalism today. Somehow there are people who only notice attacks on capitalism after a history of centuries of capitalism making the day, setting the rules. And I don't think we need to assume that we're abandoning capitalism, or that we're saying that capitalism hasn't done anything good for the world, in saying that it needs to be reformed, that there needs to serve a broader group of people. And I think one of the things that does from time to time threaten the climate change movement is that it seems like an elitist movement sometimes. And I think we need to figure out how to get more working class people, more union activity, more people who, blue collar people, to advocate for the improvements that the climate change activism would have in their lives, and to speak to people whose language they can speak. And I think that's a general problem in American politics of Western democracies, sometimes speaking only to the educated. And I think this problem won't be solved just by the educated.
Yes, there's a follow-up on that, I think, with a question that came in of how do we make changes to save the planet without foregoing the freedoms implicit in our lifestyle? I think you've been talking about that, Sandy, but Chris, would you like to just say some more about that?
Well, I think with freedom comes responsibility. And, you know, sometimes I see the people who talk most about freedom seeming to have no sense of responsibility for the future because all they want is freedom now. And I think we do have a responsibility to future generations. And I think coming back to your previous question there, higher education has a really important role because we are facing a crisis of innovation. We have to innovate socially, economically, politically, technically. And I think our universities ought to be the place where a lot of our innovation is discussed. We need to work out the changes, but we also need to get institutions to accept the need for change and be part of it. And I think that, you know, it's very easy to talk about my freedom being being threatened. For freedom of future generations to have even a halfway decent lifestyle is what we're facing. So I think we need to accept the responsibility that comes with this.
Thanks for that, Chris. Thomas Brewer asks a specific question. He asks, who should tackle black carbon particulate matter, which is one of the 3 change-forcing agents? It's neglected by the Biden agenda. So who's going to tackle this? Anybody want to take that on? Todd?
Well, the issue of what are sometimes referred to as short-term climate pollutants is a big one. I think that the Obama administration, I think Biden administration as well, is working on that broadly and has made some significant progress with respect to HFCs. That's an industrial pollutant that started back during Obama, and there's now a new, ultimately a new agreement was put together to address that. And there's one of the positives actually on the on the margins of Glasgow was a big announcement of a global methane pledge, which would reduce methane by 30% by 2030. Hopefully it could be reduced even more, but that's a big deal actually. Methane is the 2nd most important greenhouse gas, and getting it down quickly, which in theory could be done, would have a big impact on temperature between now and 2050. Black carbon, I think, has always been a part of, is seen to be part of the of that group of short-term. It's referred to as short-term because none of these agents last in the atmosphere for long time periods the way CO2 does. So in that respect, they're not as important, but they can buy us time by keeping temperature down now if we can move quickly on them. Black carbon, I don't know what the specific policy steps are that should be taken on black carbon, but black carbon ought to be part of that. We started back in the Obama administration, we started an organization to deal with, global organization to deal with these pollutants, and black carbon was part of it. So I can't give you any chapter and verse on what's going on that now, but it is one of those short-term pollutants that should be addressed.
If I can just add to that, I think that this is, obviously I'm not shy about criticizing the Biden administration or any administration. I think that the Justice 40 commitment that Todd referred to earlier actually is a commitment that directly will affect black carbon. Black carbon is that particulate matter, that tiny particulate matter causes asthma, makes it so people can't breathe. Investments in electric school buses, electric buses, reduce black carbon rates. All of that investment that is being made specifically in Black and Brown communities that live right next to coal-fired power plants, and the effort to bring down coal-fired power plants, all of that will address black carbon. And so I guess the premise of the question, I'm actually not sure I agree with, which is that the Biden administration isn't doing something on black carbon. I think they're just calling it Justice 40, and I think it's a better name.
Okay, thanks very much. We're coming to the end. There are other questions. I'm sorry I haven't been able to ask them. There was one about from Angela Preston about US and China being the biggest polluters in the world. So how do we get the great powers to act responsibly for the future? But I think that you've been talking about that throughout this interesting debate. So you might have that at the back of your mind, but I'm going to go to each of you individually and ask you this. Which is your priority action? Which is the one action which you would prioritize over all the other actions that we've been talking about from now on? Which is the one? Chris?
Whoa, one of the easy questions. I would say mobilize the money. We had a lot of talk at COP26, and this is something for every government of every richer nation. Accept that climate change is happening, accept that you have to be part of the change, and accept that that requires investment. And it may not be an immediate 5% return. Investing in helping poorer countries deal with loss and damage, in investing in adaptation, all those things may not immediately pay off, but they are A, the right thing to do, and B, if we don't invest, the consequences of failure will be so much worse. So it's basically put the budgets together, get the international agreement, make the Paris Agreement work.
Mobilize the money. Okay, Astrid, what's your one? Top of your list.
My number one is, of course, reducing emissions, but in addition to all the countries and the pledges and all that stuff and moving to renewables and what Chris said of getting the budget, I think that behavioral changes are extremely important, because if people don't make the right choices and continue making the wrong choices, there will still be demand for the bad things that we depend upon today. So the behavioral changes, as I always say that, we're talking about freedom, the freedom to choose. Right now, you can choose a better future instead of choosing a future that is not going to be sustainable. If we don't choose a better future now, the future that we're going to be facing is one without choices, is one where we won't have the choices that we have today. We'll just have to do what we need to do because things are going to be constrained. So I think that the number one thing is really global attention to behavioral change and better choices.
Thank you. Global attention to behavior change. Kea, yours?
Mine would be to participate in nonviolent direct action that puts racial justice at the heart of climate justice. And I will say that because it gives me a deep sense of purpose, and it's anchored in research like that of Erica Chenoweth, a social scientist who saw that when you have 3.5% of the population regularly engaging in direct action, you can win almost anything. Even in brutal dictatorships, you can take them down. And so I would invite everyone to join us. It gives a great sense of purpose and community, and is a great way to bring about the future that we all want.
Thank you very much. Todd.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to Sandy and Mike and all of my co-panelists for a really interesting and I think fruitful, I hope, discussion. So one quick thing, which is for anybody who's interested in those short-term climate pollutants, the organization that I was talking about that the US with a few others started, but now I think more than 100 countries, is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. They've got a website you can look. I don't know if they have things there on black carbon, they well might. To answer your question, I would say, I guess I would cheat a little bit and I would say two things. One, we've got to pass the damn Build Back Better bill so that we're not all going down the tubes. And second, diplomatic action of whatever kind is needed. I would guess it will be broad, that involves the US, the EU, and again, a reinvigorated high ambition coalition to persuade China to move at the speed and scale that it needs to move. It doesn't own, that would not only be impactful with respect to its 27% global footprint, but it would also, if you have the US, EU, and China all moving in the right direction, you start to pull in other countries on the sidelines. So if I had to do one diplomatic thing this year, that's what it would be.
Thank you for that. Over to you, Sandy. You might want to answer that question, but before I wrap up, you might want to say some other things as well.
Sure. The question of what I think is most important, I think accepting personal responsibility to do something about this one way or another. And, you know, minute gestures add up to huge progress on some things. We've seen that in this country many times, on many occasions, as Kaya says, and it's time to remember the power of the people in making positive change in a democratic society in order to keep it a democratic society. This is a good time to say thank you to all our panelists. This is just a wonderful discussion. It's just exactly what we have in mind. If you have friends who were not able to tune in, this will be available on the website of the Free Speech Project and also of Global Georgetown within a few days. And we'll have many viewers and people watching it on YouTube as well. So that is something to do. I do want to remind people of the web address of the Free Speech Project, all one word, .georgetown.edu. We are growing and pointing out threats to free speech in the United States that are growing daily and alarmingly. I want to thank a few people. I want to thank Georgetown University for its willingness, its absolutely uninhibited willingness to take up questions that are not always easy and that are important for the future of humankind. And the support of the Free Speech Project from President Jack DeGioia, from our global vice president, Tom Banchoff, and from people on all levels has been extraordinary and inspiring to me. I also want to thank my relatively new colleague, John McCabe, who's helping us grow and organize and do better work all the time. John's joining us has been a major improvement in our capacity. So thank you all for doing that, and back to you, Mike.
Well, thanks, Sandy, and my thanks to Todd, Chris, Astrid, and Kaya for a terrific debate, and to you, Sandy, for actually chairing the majority of that debate. If you ask me my answer to the question, I'd say to people, listen to your 4 answers because they were perfect. You know, I thought they were terrific. So, of course, my thanks to our colleagues at Georgetown. I'd like to thank our colleagues in Oxford as well. John O'Connor, the regent at Blackfriars, and Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute at Campion Hall, Dick Austin, the master of the hall, and Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, our Campion Hall administrators. I'd like to also thank Kinga Gabnai, our administrator at Blackfriars. My thanks to John McCabe. I'd like to thank everyone who asked questions today. There were really good questions that came through, and I did try to conflate some with others. So I hope we covered all of the areas that you wanted us to cover. The next Free Speech Project at the Crossroads, International Dialogues, in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, will actually be on Monday, the 24th of January, 2022 at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. GMT, when we'll be discussing another incredibly important issue, which is to do with old age. And if you've been watching the British news recently, certainly big issues have been coming up, certainly in the UK, and I know they are in the US about that. There are 2 further events you might like to note. 18th of January, when Professor Barbara Mejia will be discussing Teresa of Avila, and that's in the Christian Literary Imagination series. And the China series, which has really taken off during the course of this term, then the next one on that is on Friday, the 21st of January, 2022, same times, when Michelle Wang from Georgetown University will be discussing art and the Silk Road. So please join us for these events. But they're all in the new year, and we've got something to celebrate before then. So I hope everybody's going to have a happy Christmas, and I hope they're going to have a good new year. Thank you all for attending today and for your support of this series and the various series that Sandy and I are organising on behalf of Georgetown and the two halls in Oxford. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and you can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. So until next time, take care, keep safe, happy Christmas, good New Year, goodbye.